When one ending fails, blame the author. When 5 endings fail, blame the company. In any creative industry, isolated failure can be attributed to individuals. A single poorly written ending, a rushed arc, or an unsatisfying conclusion may reasonably be blamed on an author's choices, limitations, or mistakes. But when the same failure repeats across multiple unrelated works, written by different authors, with different themes, tones, and audiences, the explanation changes. The problem ceases to be personal and becomes systemic. This is the point at which Shueisha enters the conversation not as a neutral publisher, but as a structural bottleneck that repeatedly damages its own intellectual properties. Over the past decade, several of the most commercially successful and culturally dominant shonen manga series have ended, or are ending, in a strikingly similar way: compressed final arcs, underdeveloped antagonists, rushed climaxes, and unresolved thematic threads. These are not fringe titles. They are the backbone of Weekly Shonen Jump's global brand. When Bleach collapsed under narrative compression, fans were told it was the author's health. When Demon Slayer rushed to its conclusion, fans were told the author wanted to end it. When Jujutsu Kaisen fractured its final conflict, fans were told it was dark by design. When My Hero Academia began sprinting toward an ending while subplots remained unresolved, fans were told it was intentional minimalism. When Black Clover ended with a villain widely labeled a fraud, fans were told the writing fell off. But at some point, these explanations stop being credible. Different authors, different genres, different narrative goals. Same outcome. That outcome is not coincidence. It is policy. The Weekly Shonen Jump model, built for speed, not completion. Shueisha's flagship magazine, Weekly Shonen Jump, operates on a serialization model that has not fundamentally changed since the mid-20th century. Stories are released weekly, ranked by reader surveys, and continuously evaluated based on performance metrics such as popularity, merchandise sales, and animation tie-ins. This system is excellent at discovering hits. It is terrible at ending them. The weekly model incentivizes constant escalation, cliffhangers over reflection, action density over thematic digestion, momentum over structure. Endings, by contrast, require the opposite: slower pacing, retrospection, character closure, ideological resolution. The problem is that endings are unproductive under the Jump system. They do not generate long-term weekly engagement. They signal the end of merchandising cycles. They reduce magazine dependency on a hit title. As a result, endings are treated not as creative culminations, but as logistical inconveniences. This creates a subtle but powerful pressure: finish quickly. Compression as corporate strategy. Compression is not always visible as an explicit order. Shueisha does not need to say "end it now" for the effect to occur. Instead, the system applies pressure through reduced chapter allocations, final arc announcements made before narrative readiness, schedule exhaustion, silent page count expectations. When a manga enters its final arc, the countdown has already begun, regardless of whether the story is structurally prepared for closure. This is where Black Clover suffered irreparable damage. Black Clover was not failing, it was accelerated. Before the final saga, Black Clover was not a declining series narratively. It had a broad ensemble cast, ongoing ideological conflicts, unresolved world-building threads, a mythological power system that required explanation. The final antagonist, Lucius Gratis, was conceptually ambitious. He was not a brute force villain, but a manipulator of time, fate, and human evolution. His ideology, reshaping humanity under a singular perfect future, demanded philosophical confrontation. Instead, he was rushed to defeat. The result was catastrophic for perception. Readers did not experience Lucius as inevitable or overwhelming. They experienced him as incomplete. Without sufficient backstory, ideological articulation, or personal history, he became labeled a fraud villain. But villains do not become frauds because they are weak. They become frauds because the narrative fails to prove their legitimacy. That proof requires time. Time was not given. This is not an isolated case. The argument becomes unavoidable when Black Clover is placed alongside its peers. Bleach. The final arc compressed years of setup into a fraction of its needed length. Entire factions were resolved off-panel. Antagonists were defeated without adequate exploration. The ending felt less like a conclusion, and more like an evacuation. Demon Slayer. Despite immense popularity, the series ended abruptly after its final battle. Character aftermaths were truncated. World consequences were glossed over. The story ended not because it had finished saying what it needed to say, but because the system moved on. Jujutsu Kaisen. The final conflict escalated rapidly, then fractured. Character deaths occurred without narrative breathing room. Antagonistic ideology was presented but not fully interrogated. The pacing suggested not confidence, but deadline pressure. My Hero Academia. A story built on hero society, institutional critique, and generational legacy began resolving arcs before they matured. Villains with complex motivations were reduced to symbolic obstacles. The final act accelerated while thematic questions remained unanswered. Each fandom argues internally about writing quality. But the macro pattern tells a different story. When the same thing keeps happening, it is no longer talent failure. Attributing all these endings to author incompetence requires believing that multiple elite authors independently forgot how to write endings. All of them coincidentally rushed their finales. None of them needed more chapters. None of them were constrained. This belief is irrational. A far more plausible explanation is that Shueisha's production model systematically undermines long-form narrative resolution. Contrast why Webtoon and Chinese long-form systems do not collapse this way. Outside the Japanese weekly model, other industries demonstrate that long-running stories can conclude properly when the system allows it. Webtoon-based series often span multiple seasons, hundreds of chapters, clear structural breaks, planned finales. Chinese web novel ecosystems frequently support 500 to 1000 plus chapters, multiple sequel series, spin-offs, adaptations that reinforce the core narrative instead of replacing it. These systems treat stories as intellectual properties with life cycles, not weekly content streams to be optimized. Shueisha does not. The core thesis: if one manga ends badly, blame the author. If 5 of the most successful manga of a generation end badly in the same way, blame the company. Shueisha's weekly model excels at beginnings and middles. It repeatedly fails at endings. Until this changes, no amount of author talent will prevent future series from suffering the same fate. And that is why Lucius Zagratis, and many villains like him, are remembered not as what they were meant to be, but as casualties of a system that does not value narrative completion. Black Clover was not poorly written, it was left unfinished. One of the most misleading defenses of Black Clover's ending is the claim that not every mystery needs an answer. This argument only works when mysteries are thematic flavor, not when they are structural load-bearing pillars of the story. In Black Clover, many unresolved elements were not side curiosities. They were introduced as central mechanisms of the world, power system, and protagonist's identity. Leaving them unanswered does not create ambiguity, it creates absence. What follows is a comprehensive list of unresolved or abandoned mysteries, grouped by category, followed by an explanation of why their omission damaged the final arc and, by extension, the perception of Lucius Zagratis as a villain. Ayasta's origin, the core mystery that never paid off. Aster is the only known human born without mana in a world where mana defines existence. This was not a cosmetic trait, it was the foundation of the entire narrative. Unresolved questions: why was Aster born completely mana-less? Was this a natural anomaly or an engineered condition? Was it linked to Lucius's ideology of perfect humanity? Was Aster immune to Lucius's future sight because of this? Did Aster represent a flaw or an inevitability in Lucius's system? We are told what Aster is, but never why Aster exists. This is not a minor omission. In stories built on fate, evolution, and determinism, the protagonist's anomaly must have meaning. Instead, Aster's condition is treated as coincidence, a narrative dead end. A single chapter focused on Lucius investigating or acknowledging Aster's existence as an impossibility within his model of time and magic would have elevated both characters instantly. 2. Aster's father, a void where a pillar should be. Aster's mother, Lycita, received backstory and emotional framing. His father did not. This absence is not neutral. Unresolved questions: who was Aster's father? Was he human, devil, experiment, or something else entirely? How did he survive Lycita's mana-draining curse? Why was this never investigated by Lucius, who controlled bloodline manipulation? In a saga obsessed with lineage, bloodlines, and inherited power, leaving the protagonist's paternal origin blank creates a structural imbalance. It implies relevance without resolution. Even a confirmation that Aster's father was intentionally irrelevant would have been better than silence. 3. The Dwarves, a civilization introduced and forgotten. Dwarves were not hinted at, they were explicitly introduced through Charmy and her dual grimoire. Unresolved questions: where are the dwarves? What role do they play in the magical ecosystem? Why do they possess hybrid magic systems? Are they connected to pre-devil civilizations? Dwarves represent a third axis of power beyond humans and devils. Introducing them and abandoning them suggests either a cut storyline, or a forced truncation. Either way, the result is the same: world-building collapse. One short arcade, or even a lore chapter during the final saga, would have restored balance. 4. The origin of the swords, weapons without history. Aster's swords are not generic weapons. They are anti-magic conduits, devil-affecting artifacts, grimoire-bound relics, yet their origins are barely explored. Unresolved questions: who forged the swords? Were they created to kill devils, gods, or something else? Why do they resonate uniquely with Aster? Were they part of a lost anti-magic civilization? When weapons define the protagonist's fighting style and ideology, their history matters. Leaving them unexplained reduces them to plot devices rather than narrative symbols. The devils, but no gods, a one-sided cosmology. Black Clover establishes hell, devils, and underworld hierarchies in detail. But it never properly addresses the counterbalance. Unresolved questions: do gods exist in this universe? If devils embody malice and evolution, what embodies order or creation? Why does Lucius, who claims godhood, never confront actual divine entities? This imbalance becomes especially damaging in the final arc. Lucius positions himself as a god, yet the narrative provides no theological framework to challenge or contextualize that claim. As a result, his god complex feels rhetorical rather than cosmological. Vi. Lucius Zagratis, power without expression. Lucius is described as a master of time magic, a manipulator of souls, a controller of evolution, a being who can rewrite humanity's future, yet his expression of power is surprisingly narrow. Unused or underused possibilities, no planetary scale magic, no reality warping, environmental consequences, no symbolic weapon or artifact, no evolution-based magic, constructs no sword, despite swords being a central symbolic language of the series. Lucius never wielding a sword is not a flaw by itself. It becomes a flaw because the narrative never replaces that symbolism with something equally concrete. A villain of this scale needed a signature constructive visual ideology, a tangible manifestation of his perfect future. Instead, his power remains abstract, told more than shown. 7. Devils as a concept, explored, then frozen. Devils receive extensive build-up early, but the final arc does not advance their mythology. Unresolved questions: are devils a natural phenomenon or a created one? Do they evolve beyond the underworld? Is Lucius above them, or merely using them? Without escalation, the devil hierarchy plateaus just when it should have culminated. 8. The universe magic problem. Lucius is said to possess magic on a near-universal scale, control over time, souls, and evolution itself. Yet the environment remains largely intact. No collapsing skies. No rewritten geography. No visible future timelines overlapping reality. This creates a power dissonance. The villain is conceptually omnipotent but narratively constrained. That constraint is not artistic restraint, it is chapter economy. 9. How 15 to 21 chapters would have fixed everything. None of these issues required hundreds of chapters. A realistic breakdown: 3 to 4 chapters, Lucius' backstory and ideology 2 chapters, Asta's origin clarified 1 to 2 chapters, swords and anti-magic law 2 chapters, dwarves and lost civilizations 2 to 3 chapters, cosmology escalation 3 to 4 chapters, final conflict with environmental and ideological stakes. That is not bloat. That is completion. The real tragedy: Lucius is not remembered as weak because he was weak. He is remembered as weak because the story never had time to prove him inevitable. And that lack of time was not a creative choice. It was a systemic limitation imposed by a production model that prioritizes throughput over closure.